So the Carta Porte is this electronic document that allows the government to know exactly what is being moved from one place to another in Mexico.
The Carta Porte is not an obligation for the U.S. exporter in no scenario, because as Brenda already mentioned, the only entitled to issue a Carta Porte or the attachment to the commercial invoice is a taxpayer in Mexico.
Welcome to Simply Trade, brought to you by Global Training Center. My name is Lalo, and together with my co-host Andy, we have well over 60 years of combined trade, logistics, and supply chain experience. Along the way, we have seen and witnessed different challenges in trade compliance. We decided to put the show together and call on our friends and colleagues in the business to hang out with us and share their knowledge in all things trade. Thank you for spending some time with us. Enjoy the show. Andy, so we're back. We're gonna have this show. I told the audience that we excluded you from the Spanish version of it, but we're gonna be we're gonna talk about the. Go ahead.
The limited Spanish that I have, I can't say in public. It's just not a good deal. And then I would just horribly mispronounce everything. It's bad enough where I was tearing up everybody's name. You can imagine what I could do to that Spanish language. So no.
So we have.
This is going to be a good show here, Lalo.
Yeah, it is. I feel like it is, only because so we did this show in Spanish. So anybody that's hearing or listening to this show right now, and it's going to be fully in English. But if you have some counterparts in Mexico or that speak Spanish, or rather listen to this in Spanish, we just had a great show earlier this week that aired on the Carta Porte. And the reason we thought, Carta Porte is a legal requirement for companies in Mexico. But the reason I saw this was an important thing, Andy, is because as a company that we do training, one of our classes is specifically exporting to Mexico. And one of the biggest questions that we get asked is, what about this Carta Porte? You know, like they're confused. Isn't it a bill of lading? Isn't it like the any other document that we're producing? Why another document? And do we need to produce it, et cetera, et cetera? Because their Mexican counterparts are saying, hey, I need this data, I need this information, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so they're saying, I need to produce this document or eventually produce this document. How can you help me or how can you support me with this? And so again, I know it's a Mexican legal document. We hope it spills over to the Mexican audience, which would be great. We are a global or a worldwide type broadcast. You know, we're not limited to just the U.S. So I'm hoping this would help. You know, so that's why I brought in these two experts to talk about the Carta Porte.
Well, let me say that for our audience in particular, this is something that y'all need to look at, especially if you do business into Mexico, if you have any subsidiaries or affiliated companies in Mexico, or any fashion thereof, a supply chain back and forth. This is something that you really do need to look at this. This is a scenario where there have been so many U.S. regulations on requirements for certain to meet certain regulations and data elements that having to reach out and gain information from around the world. Well, in this case, this is a new Mexican requirement of Mexican companies. And we're going to get into the details on this, but this is something that you need to make sure that if you are a U.S.-based company, or for that matter, a non-Mexican company, and doing business down in Mexico, you need to make sure that you are listening to this, follow up with your supply chain so that, and your purchasing departments and all that, so that the information flow is going down there. So that'll be the action for y'all on that one. Lalo, I'm looking forward to hearing about this because I've heard about this for a while. I know Mexico has delayed some of the implementation, and I got to tell you, to me, it's clear as mud. I'm confused on some of this. So I'm looking forward to talking here with our two guests. Why don't you introduce them, and then we're going to get started.
I will. So we have on the show today, we have they're both partners in a law firm. The law firm is Grupo Legal Aduanero. Correct, Brenda? Okay, so Grupo Legal Aduanero. And so the guests are Brenda, I'm going to say it in English, Cordova, but I think is pronounced Cordova. And then we also have her partner, which is Francisco de la Cruz. So with Francisco, well, just a quick history on these two folks. Brenda has, she is always at in the states doing talks about Mexican customs and laws and regulations as an attorney. Gives great information. She has a good following here in the states. Always at conferences like ICPA, etc. So she'll be doing that. She has done that. But Francisco, he's a former employee of the of Mexicans version, I guess, of CBP. Although it's not really CBP, it's SAT, El SAT. So he worked there for about 15 years. So he's got his degree and also his not practice, but he is an attorney in Mexico, as is Brenda. But just wanted to make sure, kind of qualify this. But yeah, so we have Francisco de la Cruz and Brenda Cordova. Welcome, both of you.
Yeah, welcome, both of you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you today.
We're glad to have you.
We have been excited on one thing. I will tell you, our podcast. We're very humbled in the support we're getting. So I want to say real quick before we forget it, thank you to everybody who's listening out there in the downloads. This is going to be a show that you're going to really want to learn here. I'm looking forward to this. But Francisco, now you were with Mexican Customs. Is that what I just heard? How long were you there?
Yes, hello to everyone. Actually, I worked for the tax administration service in Mexico like more than 15 years. I will say like 18 years in different areas of the government, different branches. And one of them was an area related precisely with the area which will be in charge of verifying the compliance of the requirements of the Carta Porte for the taxpayers and importers in Mexico.
Okay. Brenda, and you've been with this firm, and I assume, you don't have a customs background yourself, but obviously you got a very strong legal background.
I have been, since 1994. I was working with Adrian Bramuller with the Bramuller Law Group since then.
I love Adrian. She's good.
I know. And Francisco and I have alliances with Bramuller Law Group, and we do a lot of work with them. And also, I just completed the doctoral degree on customs and trade here in Mexico, customs and trade law. Mm-hmm. So, all these years working with Adrian, with Francisco and Adrian has given, exposed me to a different and a wide variety of customs and trade topics in Mexico, and especially dealing and helping U.S. companies and U.S. individuals understand how Mexican customs works.
All right, so let me just jump right in here. We've been talking about the Carta Porte. What the Sam Hill is it? I mean, Carta Porte is like and if I'm not mistaken, it's a compliment letter, right? A letter for the port, or what? I'm forgive my ignorance here, but I'm looking. You're gonna have to almost draw me a picture there, Brenda and Francisco.
Well, the Carta Porte, first of all, there was a lot of noise and new information about the Carta Porte on December from the year 2020. Right. The Carta Porte is an electronic complement or an attachment to the electronic invoice in Mexico for anyone moving goods within the Mexican territory, whether they provide transportation services to third parties or their clients, or if they own the goods and they own the vehicles. So the Carta Porte is this electronic document that allows the government to know exactly what is being moved from one place to another in Mexico. Therefore, the Carta Porte has all the information needed to identify the type of goods, the shipper, the recipient, the consignee, the mean of transportation, information about the vehicle, information about anything regarding that transportation operation. Now, I would like to point out that, in 2020, when we first, and a lot of people first heard about the Carta Porte, and we saw all of these requirements, we were like, what is this? Why is the government wanting all this information if it's already listed on the pedimento? It's already on the invoice. It's already on the bill of lading. Why do we have to duplicate efforts? Why do we have to do, double work? To duplicate efforts. But the thing is that the Carta Porte has been in Mexico. We go back to the transportation law from 1993, and we see that the Carta Porte is a legal document. It's a contractual relation between the transporter service provider and the consignee or the owner of the goods. And if we go more, we dig more and deep back into the history, we know that the Mexican Code of Commerce from 1889, this is 134 years ago, we know that the Carta Porte requirement was there. So this Carta Porte has all of this, information regarding what is being moved in the country.
Okay, let me stop for just a second. So as we're going through this, yes. So it is predominantly a domestic shipment requirement in Mexico. So it's from one point of Mexico to another point in Mexico. Is that correct? Whereas the pedimento is for the international transaction. It's if you're crossing the international border, the pedimento would come into play, even though it's got similar information or same information. The function, I'm just trying to delineate between, if I'm going to take something, I'm in the U.S., I drive a truck or have a shipment that's by truck and it moves across the border, southern U.S. border, into Mexico, I've got to have a pedimento of what's going in. But then I also, if that is then going to travel inland into Mexico, I should also have a Carta Porte. Is that correct?
Hello, Andy.
It depends.
I think this is a very, very interesting question. And I think one of the main things that we have to have in mind when we are talking about the Carta Porte is that this documento, the Carta Porte, it's a domestic regulation. And as Brenda already mentioned, it applies mainly for the activity regarding moving goods from one place to another. So regarding your question, I think it's very important to say that the pedimento is the document related with the compliance of the tariff regulations and non-tariff regulation by the time someone is importing goods into Mexico. So let's say that the pedimento it's to prove that the goods were legally imported and that were subject to the customs clearance. That's precisely why the pedimento is. But if you are going to move those same goods that were imported by any port of entry to Mexico, in addition, you will need the Carta Porte if you are going to move the goods from the port of entry to another place within Mexico. I think one of the important points here to remark is, for example, the importance of the use of the Incoterms. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to talk about the way we can use correctly the Incoterms. But for example, as you mentioned at the beginning of this chat, there are so many U.S. exporters that have in Mexico subsidiaries or related parties, or they work permanently with companies having an IMEX program. So they need to establish a very defined line dividing the obligations related with the importing and the moving of the goods. For example, if a U.S. exporter is sending goods to a state within Mexican territory, for example, let's say something Mexico City or Michoacan, under an Incoterm that implies the delivery of the good directly in the premises of the importer, of the buyer in Mexico, I think Carta Porte is not needed. But, for example, if you deliver the goods under a free on board Incoterm, and you deliver to the importer the goods in the port of entry, and then the importer in Mexico is going to contract an enterprise for the purposes of the transportation of the goods from the port of entry to the final destination, they will of course need a Carta Porte by means of the transportation. So I think with this we can differentiate very clearly that the pedimento it's only to show or to evidence that the goods were subject to the customs clearance and is not comply with all the Mexican regulation in order to be imported into Mexico. But the
Okay.
Carta Porte is needed when you are moving the goods from one place to another.
Okay, so let me delineate this again a little bit. Is that let's just say I'm going to take a small part. Let's say that I'm shipping a widget, and I'm going to use FedEx or UPS, and let's just say I'm using the ground services. So I fill out the bill of lading, the commercial invoice. Let's just say it's something that's worth, I don't know, say $2,000 US. So I have US export things I've got to take care of on that. But as it goes across, the information from the bill of lading and the commercial invoice is going to be then utilized from a broker's perspective in creating a pedimento. It crosses the border. Let's just say it's down there. What is it? Let's just say that we're going from El Paso. We're going to cross at Juarez, and it crosses down in there. So it's going to clear Mexican customs in Juarez. Pedimentos provided, and in that case, let's say that the item's going to be delivered in a little town, maybe let's say an hour's drive from Juarez. So it would go in normally. Let's say it's cleared. It goes to a FedEx or UPS station. They transload it, and because it's a cleared shipment now, but it goes on to the final destination and is delivered. In that case, it's still all part of the same service, same carrier in this sense. It's not going to need a Carta Porte versus if I, let's say, send let's say the same widget and it requires, let's say it's worth $2,000. It's sitting on a pallet and I'm shipping it by a truck. And that goes into, let's say that I send it again, let's say FedEx, UPS, ABC Trucking Company, whatever. And they go down to over to El Paso. It crosses over into Juarez and is cleared. But then it's moved to a Mexican trucking company who then takes that pallet and takes it on further inland and delivered. In that scenario, it's a cleared shipment. It becomes a domestic shipment. It changes carriers. And based on what I'm hearing is that a Carta Porte would then be required for that versus the first scenario. Have I got that right? The first time was through, let's say, FedEx or UPS. It goes all the way. The second one is it's cleared by truck and switches carriers and then delivered to by a domestic carrier.
Well, I think we should first note that the Carta Porte is an attachment to the electronic invoice, which is issued by whoever is transporting goods, whether it's the owner of the goods or whether it's a service provider that is transporting the goods. So in order to determine if the owner of the goods, the owner of the vehicle who is transporting its own goods, or a transportation services company, a freight forwarder, the first thing to identify here is that, number one, it has to be a Mexican entity incorporated in Mexico. It has to be a taxpayer. In other words, it has to have a permanent establishment. So if you are in the US and you hire DHL or anybody located, incorporated in the US to send your goods, and this company will use a vehicle, the same vehicle that leaves Texas, and the same vehicle clears customs, leaves customs in the same vehicle and container until it arrives to its final destination, and this vehicle is not owned by a Mexican taxpayer, then it is not necessary to have the Carta Porte. And it's not necessary because whoever is the foreign transporter or owner of the vehicle is not or cannot issue a Mexican electronic invoice. Because the Mexican electronic invoice, and I say Mexican electronic invoice, is because this electronic invoice, it's called CFDI in Mexico. That's the Mexican acronym. And this invoice can only be generated and issued by Mexican entities having a permanent establishment. So that would be like the bottom line. Are you a U.S. entity? Are you a foreign entity sending and shipping goods to Mexico that clear customs? Then do I need a Carta Porte? It depends. If your vehicle arrives to Mexican customs and right there is going to be, the goods will be unloaded and then loaded into a vehicle that is owned by a Mexican entity registered in Mexico and has a permanent establishment in Mexico, then the Carta Porte is a must. Otherwise, it's not necessary.
So more than likely, Brenda, that here's where I'm going with this, is that I'm trying to identify where people can look at this and is in from based on what you just said, if it changes vehicles, which chances are, if you're using a transportation company, because there's very few shipments that are going to be crossing the border and delivered in the same vehicle. It's usually, even if it's a trucking company, or even if you have your own, you're going to switch trailers, you're going to switch, drivers, or something. So I would say probably in excess of 90% of the volume that crosses the border by chance is going to change vehicles. That said, all I'm trying to get at is, okay, for people listening, think of their supply chain, think of their data flows that they're going to need to look at this. So I've kind of picked up on a couple of things. Is more than likely a Carta Porte is going to be required, and the non-Mexican entity that's sending goods in there or having it moved is going to need to supply the information to the Mexican taxpayer, who and then can have that Carta Porte created and uploaded. So here's a question for you: is that me as a let's just say Andy Shiles Incorporated, I'm going to send down to Francisco. Here I've got a whole truckload of or half a truckload of widgets for you, and as I'm sending this down, I'll have the bill of lading, I'll have the commercial invoice and anything else that's needed for clearance. But the Carta Porte is not going to be filed by me. I may supply information to Francisco, but he's going to be the one that has to complete the Carta Porte, or his agent, I would assume, and then be able to upload that Carta Porte so that it then electronically attaches. Is that correct?
Yes, Andy, you are right. Usually, the attachment for the pedimento in Mexico are the commercial invoice, the bill of lading, the packing list, the certificate of origin in the case you are applying preferential tariff treatment from the U.S. exporter. The Carta Porte is not an obligation for the U.S. exporter in no scenario, because as Brenda already mentioned, the only entitled to issue a Carta Porte or the attachment to the commercial invoice is a taxpayer in Mexico. So there's no way that a U.S. exporter has its own Mexican tax ID. So answering very concrete your question, no, it's not an obligation for the UX exporter, but you are also right when you say that the exporter needs to provide to the Mexican importer all the information needed for the importer in Mexico to fulfill the Carta Porte. So that's correct in both things, in both a very important aspect that you already mentioned, Andy.
I mean, Francisco and Brenda have talked about all this data or information that needs to be on there, and I try to make a point of it previously in the Spanish version of this show. Is we have USMCA that requires a certification of origin, requires certain data. 10+2 requires certain data. It's by law you have to have these data elements, etc. So Francisco and or Brenda, both of you, any one of you, why don't you explain, like, I know it's going to be a lot, but let's just in summary, what is required to be on that document? I mean, data wise, I mean, only because we're talking about what the exporter here in the US, what does Andy Shiles Incorporated need to provide to Francisco SADCB? What does he need to provide to them? I mean, what kind of data is required for this document?
There is a wide list of requirements, and Francisco can go through them. We have counted over 180 blank spaces that have to be completed for the Carta Porte. Not all of the 180 blank spaces apply, but you have to review all of them and select and choose the one that applied to your operation. So it depends if you are using sea, how do you say, like railroad, or by road or air transportation. But there is a wide list of requirements, and Francisco can cover them.
Yeah, I can summarize this data, this information, in three main fields: the information regarding the transportation, the data regarding to the goods, and the information regarding the destination, the origin and the destination of the goods. And based on that, imagine any kind of information you can related to the transport, the type of transportation, if it is a truck, if it is I don't know, whatever you can imagine. Relating with the goods, the type of goods, the description, the unit measure, the weight, the whatever you can imagine regarding, and with the destinations, where it comes from, the address, what is it located, and what is the road you are going to use to get to the destination, and also regarding the destination, of course, the address and all the information regarding the address. So there's a lot of information, but I could summarize those information in those three main fields: the information related to the transport, the information of the merchandises, the goods, and the information of the origin and the final destination of the goods.
Okay, so let me ask this question. With that's a lot of detail, especially from a standpoint that if you've hired a transportation company to move your goods, you may not know the actual route that they're going to take, and you're telling me that you need to detail what roads they're going to take or highways and all that. So here's a question for you. Who's looking at who looks at this data? Where the point being is what government entity is this going to, and who has oversight of this? What are they going to do with it?
That's a very good question, Andy, because, okay, since the Carta Porte, going back to the 1899, that's from the Code of Commerce for Mexico, we had the Minister of Transportation. That would be the federal governmental entity responsible for supervising that. Then, with this new amendment, which basically is to, in addition to the contractual obligations between the freight forwarder and the consignee or whoever is hiring the transportation services, now we have the tax authorities supervising and controlling that whoever is receiving an income or making business for the transportation services is paying the correspondent duties or taxes for those services that are being provided. So we have, number one, the Minister of Transportation. Number two, now with the amendment, the tax authorities, but the tax authorities involve the customs authorities. Now, since recently the Mexican government amended its regulations in order to have the Mexican militaries to be responsible for the controlling, administration, and operation of customs, now we have this other entity responsible for that. So that's why I say it's a good question, because this has resulted in many complaints or even uncertainty from companies saying, okay, so now who is going to be supervising and inspecting me? If there is a point of inspection in the middle of the road, of a federal road in Mexico, do I have to stop? And is that a real authority, or is it like somebody, from somebody who is not part of the government and wants to check on what I'm moving in Mexico? So that also brings kind of uncertainty and security issues for companies. Now, if you have the Minister of Transportation, so you know what you need to comply with. If you have the tax authorities, so you want to make sure that taxes are paid on the services that are provided, or duties if the goods are imported. But if you have the militaries, they are going to check that everything is very correct, that there are no clerical errors, that there are no typos. And so that's kind of scary for some companies, having the militaries also inspecting. And all of the information and documentation that, integrates the import and export or transportation file has to match. So if you have your pedimento, which is the Mexican entry or export summary form, you
Right.
have the bill of lading or transportation document, the insurance, and everything has to match. And if there are clerical errors, so that could also end up on having a Carta Porte invalid. And a Carta Porte that is invalid means, or can mean, depending on the interpretation of the authority, that there is a contraband. So that's why companies have to be very careful, because it's not what I have seen compared to the US. A clerical error, a human error, cannot, and it is not always a situation that can diminish or lower the sanction, because a clerical error makes a document invalid, and an invalid document means a violation. And a violation, depending on who reviews it or depending on the factors, can be a crime.
Yeah.
Going to that extreme.
Go. So as we're going through this, when is a Carta Porte filed? I mean, in this process, if you are importing goods into Mexico, because I'm focused right now just predominantly a non-Mexican company and a non-Mexican origin location, from whatever country, U.S., Canada, Europe, whatever, they're sending shipments down to you with the information. When the pedimento is filed, the Mexican customs broker that filed the pedimento, are they in turn reaching out to the Mexican taxpayer and say, do you want me to file your Carta Porte now, create it and file it, or based on the information they have? Or when in this process does the Carta Porte get created with an international transaction?
The Carta Porte should be created at the time the invoice for the transportation, whether it's by the owner or the service provided, is created. So that should be created within the same time. There is a platform by the Mexican Federal Tax Authority that also gives you and allows you to the platform where you can create the complemento Carta Porte as well.
Great.
So independent if you are the owner or the service provider, you choose one or the other to create your complemento.
Lalo, you started to say something?
No, well, I was going to say, well, I mean, this is certainly a lot of information to take in, and I know we're going to fall short here with a lot more information, but I may try to convince Brenda and Francisco to put together a little webinar or something for us that will go on a little longer, because White Day sounds like we need about a good hour and a half of visuals and explanations. But I mean, for now, I think we may have covered a good part of it, and at least to pique the interest and to get people acquainted with what they need for the Carta Porte. I mean, that was just more of what we try to get with this show anyway. So I don't know, in anything in closing, I guess, from either one of you, or Andy, I don't know if you have a last question or what, just so we can wrap up now, because unfortunately we are
We've
right
ran
at
out of
around
time.
our time limit. Yeah.
Right. Well, let me defer to Brenda first. Is there any closing comments that you'd like to make?
I would like to say that anybody doing business in Mexico, whether it's incorporated or not in Mexico, but has suppliers, buyers, or any type of business relation in Mexico, should be aware that there are many changes to the regulations, which are being published almost every day in the Mexican regulations. That or Mexican regulations are segregated or dispersed. They're not in one title, not in one document, something like the US has, the 19 CFR. We don't have that in Mexico. So you have to be aware about all these changes, and that you have to even, and when I say this in English, it's like you have to go and dive in the deep, big ocean and look for different regulations, different laws, different amendments by different entities when it comes to Mexican customs. So do not feel confident that if you find an answer that you're looking for in one specific article of one law, do not say, oh, I just found the answer. I would say continue reviewing, because there are exemptions to the exemptions in different laws, in different regulations, in different books by different authorities and different entities. So I would say don't give up. Always continue studying, reviewing, and training yourself and your people.
Francisco, how about yourself? Any last thoughts from you?
Yes, Andy, I would like to close very quickly by answering your last question. We know for sure that the tax administration service is the one who is behind this information. But what we don't know what they really intend to do with the information. We are still trying to understand what are they intending with all this information. And so
It's like here's the requirement. Just trust us. We want all this information. It's like, well, yeah, what are you going to do with it? No, don't worry about it. Just trust us. Yeah. It's
exactly,
like, oh boy.
because actually this information is already in some other documents or in some other databases from the tax administration service. But especially for these reasons, or for things like this, it's very important that we keep updated all the time. And I think these kind of activities like these podcasts are very important for the audience to keep updated on this type of issues.
Well, let me say this way, and as we're closing, so I'm going to make a statement kind of to recap this, and then you better holler if I don't have this correctly. But for our listeners, basically is that there's the required data elements, which is pretty much what you're supplying with the vast majority of the parties to the transaction, what the commodities are of the goods and all of that. Some of the transportation related details may have to come from the transportation company themselves. Regardless, getting that information to you, and I'm sure trying to do it as early in the process as possible, would be a good thing. That's one thing. Second thing is that whether an item requires a Carta Porte or not, that's on the Mexican taxpayer and whatever that entity is that's going to be party, that somehow they're going to have to be a party to the transaction. But I would say that if a company is doing business with anyone in Mexico, be sure you, before the transaction takes place, talk this kind of stuff out. Look at, review the financial transactions, including what the terms of sale are, or, what we call Incoterms. If you don't know what an Incoterm stands for, international terms of sale here, or international commercial terms, it's learn that kind of stuff. But here's the thing: what would be the appropriate Incoterm? So your purchasing department, your legal departments need to get involved, your accounting and all that, to figure out the right things. And then finally, I would highly, highly recommend that people reach out to a Mexican customs law firm or entity of that nature as an advisor to say, here's what we're striving. This is the information we've got. Reach out. Are we okay with this? This is going to be an ongoing, it's going to be a one-time deal, whatever. But the more expensive the commodities are, if you're shipping down large pieces of equipment down into Mexico or out of Mexico, it would be highly worth the money to talk to a customs attorney down there, a firm. This is what we're striving for, and gain some legal advice to say, yes, you're good to go, or here's what you need to do. Would you all agree with those statements?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you summarized this very well.
Mm-hmm. I will say this, Lalo, there's definitely a need for more of it, like a webinar and additional training for this kind of stuff. So, folks, we're going to be looking at, keep your eyes and ears open. So I'm sure there'll be some advertisements on some of that as we put together a program with the appropriate people do that. But this is something that, again, it's outside the norm of some of the things we talk about, but more specifically, it's our counterparts in Mexico have, the bar has been raised, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with the government entities that are involved or not. Chances are, who's looking at the data? The tax authorities. I guarantee you, they're going to come up and say, oh, we're missing out on revenue in this thing, and come up with taxes, more than likely. But that is conjecture on my part. But so I think, yeah, definitely our listeners are going to benefit from further information on this.
Yes, so, I agree. And I guess just to wrap it up, thank you so much, Brenda and Francisco. You were patient enough to do 2 shows with us today, and hopefully you can get up and stretch your legs and go and rest. But thank you so much. Thanks for doing that, and we really appreciate your attendance here. And we hope to do more. If the Spanish show went well, I would love to do more shows with you, because, as Brenda said, it's like diving into an ocean of regulations. So there's always content to cover.
Well, and to our listeners too, we need to give us feedback.
Right.
Send us questions and all that. If you want to know more about this kind of stuff, we'll set up additional shows for you. But,
yeah,
this will be good. So, but thank you, Brenda and Francisco. You guys have been great. Appreciate you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter @simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading.